want to begin by acknowledging Kwantlen, Katzie, and Matsqui First Nation, as they have been huge supporters in my life for the last 20 years. And it's the community that I'm able to live, work, and raise my family in. So thank you. I'm going to share a journey with you, and it's my journey. It's my very personal journey. And I ask you to come along with me, walk beside me for the next 18 minutes. Put everything down, put it aside, and just walk with me. I was born in June of 1963. My mom lived in Butedale with her family. My mom was a 15-year-old girl who found herself pregnant. Tough times in the 1960s to be unwed, 15, and pregnant. She had met my dad because my dad, Aboriginal people, including my dad, would come and fish out of the cannery in Butedale. And that's where they met, and that's where their relationship began. It's always interesting to find out people who know Butedale, where I'm talking about, which is in the north coast of British Columbia, very small community. But my mom knew she would have to give me up for adoption. And I was born in Prince Rupert, and the nurses put me in the back of the nursery with a floor-to-ceiling curtain around the bassinet, in order that if my mom walked by, she wouldn't be able to see me. So my mom never held me. She never saw me. She had to give me a name. She named me. And then she left the hospital. And she left that little girl behind. And she never forgot about me, though. When I left the hospital, I went to a foster home where I spent 6 weeks. I still wonder about that foster family. Who held me? Who fed me? Who nurtured me? I'm looking for them still today because they're an important part of my puzzle that I'm trying to put together. After I was with my foster family for 6 weeks, the social worker moved me to who would eventually become my adoptive family, my adoptive mom and dad. My dad was a United Church minister, and my mom was an elementary school teacher. And they were living in a very small, very remote Aboriginal community in northern British Columbia. At that time, it was called Port Simpson, is now called Lac La Hams. And my dad was the minister there. And in that community, mom and dad became very good friends with a young couple. And that young couple had 2 children. There's Sue on the left, myself in the middle, and Tom on the right. And Uncle Murray and Aunt Louise became very good friends with my mom and dad. So we grew up calling them Aunt Louise and Uncle Murray, and this was their 2 children. And I'm about 6 months old in that picture. Growing up, my parents had always talked about adoption. It wasn't something foreign to me. It wasn't a conversation that was strained. And my parents had always said, when you're ready to search, when you're ready to find out, we will help in any way we can. And although at times growing up I thought about it, typically through my teenage years, but it wasn't until I had my first son, David, and I was 24 years old. And I had David in 1987. And it's very hard to put into words what the feeling was when I held David for the first time. Because David was the first person in my life I was biologically connected to. And that was very powerful because we all need connections. We all need connections. And I realized then that I needed to find out my truth, and I needed to find out my story. And I needed to do it not only for me, but for my children. They deserve to know. I decided I would search out, and I searched out and I found my mom back in 1989. It was a very quick reunion, one that happened very fast. She lives in Delta. She's only 40 minutes away from me. And here I had wondered, are you okay? Where do you live? What do you do? Are you married? Do you have children? All those typical questions that I would ask myself. And I met her. I went over that night, and we met her. And she was married. She didn't have children after me, so I'm her only child. She had always wondered about me, had never forgotten about me, had actually written poems to me that she gave me the night I met her. I have her only 2 grandchildren. It was a very powerful connection. During that night, I also asked her who my birth father was. And luckily, she was very honest with me. She said to me, your birth father's name is Haisla First, and he comes from Kitimat village. I went home that night because I had promised my adoptive parents I would call them and let them know how the meeting went with my birth mom. I went home that night and I called my adoptive parents. And we were talking about my mom and what she does and where she lives, how it went. And I said, she told me who my dad was. And I said, I want to find him because he's culturally who I believe I am and who I thought I was. I needed to find out who he was. So I said to my mom and dad, I want to find him. His name is Haisla First. He comes from Kitimat. I'm going to start to look for him. And interestingly, my mom said to me, well, she said to my dad, John, didn't Aunt Louise come from Kitimat? And wasn't Aunt Louise's maiden name Paul? And could Aunt Louise be related to Cecelia? And my mom said, I'm going to call Aunt Louise right now and ask her. I said, okay. And she hung up the phone with me, and I sat by the phone, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. My mom hung up with me and called Aunt Louise, who was still living in Prince Rupert with Uncle Murray. And she said, Celia just found her birth mom tonight. And birth mom is saying that dad is Haisla First from Kitimat, and we're just wondering if you're related. And my Auntie Louise said to my mom, I have to go, but I'll call you back. We waited some more, and some more, and some more. And my Auntie Louise called her older brother, Haisla First. And she said, did you have a daughter back in 1963? And he went very quiet. And he said, yes. And my Auntie Louise said, I've known her whole life. This picture is of me with my cousins. In our community, in my language, we don't have a word for cousins. We are raised as brothers and sisters. So really, had I been raised in my community with my family, they would have been my brothers and sisters. It's a very powerful picture, and it's a very powerful story of connection, although we didn't know. My Uncle Murray would often wonder, where did I come from? Who did I belong to? Who is this little girl? As he held me. And it wasn't until 24 years later that all of a sudden everything started to make sense. It was very safe and wonderful to have Aunt Louise be my natural aunt and have that relationship with my adoptive parents, because I can only imagine, as a parent, what it would be like to know that your child's going through a reunion with their family and how scary that might be. So Mom and Dad, I know, were quite relieved to know that Aunt Louise was a part of my family because she wasn't a stranger. It was very safe. My dad flew down to Vancouver to meet me. And this is, we're meeting for the first time. And there's my mom, my dad, myself, and my Auntie Louise. And my Auntie Louise and I are very close. And my dad and I are very close. And when I look at that picture, I realize everybody came together. All my parents came together to do what was best for me. To do what was best for me. And I'm very lucky. I also knew now, finally, where I belonged. I belonged to the Haisla First Nation. My Aboriginal name, Nuyamzit Sexdukwia. I know who I am. I'm a proud Aboriginal woman who has walked in the two worlds. I know that, and that's a gift. As I got to know my dad and spend time with my dad, he would start to share stories with me. Stories of a young boy at 10 being sent to residential school, and the day that happened. And how residential school changed who he was and had intergenerational effects on all his children as well. Shared his truth, I began to learn more about residential schools. And I'll be honest, I didn't know anything about residential schools. I didn't know about that truth and that history. And so it was through my dad that I began to hear those stories. This is the Alberni Residential School on Vancouver Island. This is where my dad was sent. It's a pretty scary looking building to me, and I can't imagine being 10 years old and sent away from your family and not having contact with them for 4 years. What that did to that little boy. In 2008, the former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, apologized to all Aboriginal people in Canada for what happened in residential schools. Because what was happening, survivors like my dad were finding their voice, being able to share about the experiences that they went through. And they were horrendous experiences. Out of the apology came the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to Vancouver in 2013. And it just so happened that I had volunteered for like all 4 days to help out at this event. And my dad phoned me just before it started and said, "Sweetheart, I'm coming to Vancouver and could I stay with you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, well, sure, but I'm going to this event and I'm volunteering, but you can come." I said, "Would you like to come? It's all about residential schools." "Yeah, I'd like to come." So for the first day, he was very quiet and he just watched. The second day was amazing because there was university students and students from districts around the province who were coming and they were learning this history. And Dad was sitting with survivors, people he had gone to school with. And all of a sudden, my dad was getting more comfortable. And one of Dad's friends said to him, "You should testify. Share your experience, have it recorded." And my dad said no. We were driving home that night, and my dad said, "Sweetheart, I think I want to testify." I said, "That's great." He did testify. And when we got home the next night, he wanted to show me the DVD of his testimony, and it was so hard to watch. It was very emotional. He was very truthful about his experiences. When he went in to testify, I gave him a hug and I whispered in his ear, "You're doing this so that we don't forget. So that we don't forget my dad's story and the 80,000 other survivors that are still alive today. We don't want to forget, and we can't forget." This is my dad and I at the Truth and Reconciliation Walk. 80,000 people showed up in the pouring rain and the wind, and they walked. And I whispered in my dad's ear and I said, "They're walking for you. They're walking for you as a survivor." And I realized looking at this picture, my dad's no longer alone. This was a journey that many survivors had to do alone, but not anymore. This past June, the Truth and Reconciliation was closing, and they were releasing their interim report in Ottawa. And I said to my husband, "I have to go. I need to be in Ottawa, and I want to go alone. I want to do this journey all by myself." And my husband said, "Okay." Off to Ottawa I went. On the Sunday, there was a Truth and Reconciliation walk, And there was Aboriginal people, non-Aboriginal people, and religious organizations. They were all marching. And I was marching with a couple of women, and we were drumming and singing, and I was wearing my button blanket. What was interesting, we walked from Gatineau, Quebec, to downtown Ottawa. I didn't realize how many churches were in Ottawa and Gatineau, Quebec. There's a lot of churches. As we were marching, they had organized the church bells to toll. It was a very powerful moment for me because it was my moment of reconciliation. I had been raised in the United Church. I had been raised in the United Church. I had a dad who went to residential school. And this was my form of reconciliation, my form of understanding. And those church bells were incredibly powerful. And I'm very lucky that I was able to go to Ottawa to experience that. The interim report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had 94 recommendations. Some of them are complicated, some of them are responsibilities to government and different levels of government, and some of them are just for you and I. And I ask you, what's your commitment to reconciliation on a personal level and a professional level? What's your commitment to reconciliation, of understanding this truth? My commitment is sharing my dad's story. And when I phoned my dad to say I'm going to be doing this, I said, I need your permission. And he said, yes, it's important people know the truth. My dad deserves that. My dad deserves that everybody understands the truth and the history of residential schools. But even more beyond that is that you need to understand, whether you work in schools, whether you're a parent or a grandparent, you need to understand that every child has a story. Take the time to find out what their stories are, so that they don't have to walk alone, that you're with them. So I thank you for walking the journey with me, all my relations.